Thanks to Godin Jin for sharing about his advocacy work, and thanks to you for watching. Join us again next time on Sharing Our Cultures.
If you want convenience, Marie's Mini Mart is here for you. A one-stop shop for a variety of products, home-style breads, sandwiches, plus check out our freshly baked artisan breads and single-serve desserts exclusively at our in-store bakery on Frecker Drive. With 25 locations, wherever you go, there we are.
At Sharing Our Cultures, our programs, projects, and events focus on engaging school children and youth from diverse cultural backgrounds as they integrate into the society in Newfoundland and Labrador. We connect them with the locals and community partners for opportunities to improve their socio-cultural and employability skills, and most importantly, to make new friends. We invite you to learn more about Sharing Our Cultures on our website, YouTube channel, and social media platforms.
We want to hear from you. Provide feedback on this show or find out how you can get involved. Call, email us, or scan the QR code to take our quick survey.
After a night out with your friends, there's always options for getting home safely. You could call your BFF, your mom or dad, whoever you can count on for a safe ride home. You could call your favorite cab company or 1-888 taxi guy. Or you could use the Arrival Live smartphone app to help you choose your ride. Be it a friend, transit, or taxi, getting home safely is app easy. Now available for iOS and Android devices. Visit arrivallive.org to find out more. Arrival Live. Drive sober.
You're watching an interesting local show on Rogers TV and you want to know more. That's when you head to rogerstv.com. Our website provides more information about our programs, our hosts, our schedule, and about how you too can get involved with Rogers TV. Visit us online at rogerstv.com.
In the early years of the 20th century, thousands of brave Newfoundlanders and Labradorians answered the call to serve in World War I. Many would never return, and those who did came home forever changed. Their sacrifices shaped our history, yet so many of their stories remain untold, until now. Welcome to our Unsung Heroes, World War I stories from Newfoundland and Labrador. In this series, we speak with the families of those who fought, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, relatives, and community members who have carried their memories forward. Through their words, we bring to life the courage, heartbreak, and resilience of a generation that gave everything for their home and country. Join us as we uncover the deeply personal stories of Newfoundland and Labrador's unsung heroes. Not all battles were fought on land. Many Newfoundlanders served at sea during World War I, including Chesley Miles from Herring Neck. His story is one of bravery and deception, as he sailed aboard a ship designed to outwit the enemy in the dangerous waters of the Atlantic. To share more about Chesley's remarkable service, here's Mike Windsor.
Hi, my name is Mike Windsor, and about 45 years ago when I started teaching, and I know I don't look that old, I was given this postcard by a co-teacher, and it had a picture on it of Chesley Miles. And Chesley, as you can see by his cap, served on the HMS Britain, where a lot of the Newfoundlanders trained before they went into service into World War I in the Navy. And Chess's Navy service was very interesting. Chess had humble beginnings. He was born in Herring Neck, and I have his homestead is out there, the foundation, the cellar that belonged to his house, and he also probably not far from his house there's a stage there, and in the stage is probably similar to the one that he served at or did some work at as a boy. And a very humble beginning, very unknown person, which falls in line with our unknown heroes. And Chesley joined up. He was, let me see, I have a service record here. He was born in 1897, but enlisted when he was 19. So for some people, he was a little bit late enlisting. And his war record here shows where he served and was trained on the Britain, which was also known as the Calypso. And one of the postings he had was, I guess the most interesting one, was the Farnborough, the HMS Farnborough, which was a Q5 ship. Queensland 5, and it was called Queensland because that's where they refitted them and put the guns in. They had 20 millimeter guns and Maxim guns and things like that, and they would build chicken coops because they wanted to make these tramp steamers or small destroyers look like they were harmless. So they kind of had two crews on them. And I never did find out which crew Chesley was on. One was they were all good men of the sea, even the ones that were on the panic party. And that would be there'd be about 24 men on a ship. Half of them would be the professional ones that are seen. And the panic party would be the ones that when they would come across a submarine, they would abandon ship, and it would be in a panic. The Commander Gordon was the captain of the ship. One of the men even had a stuffed parrot on the ship. So when they first encountered their first submarine, the German submarine, he called abandoned ship, and they sent out 4 boats. Now, I want you to imagine back in the Farnborough, the Queen Q5, there were 12 men hidden and 12 men running away in these smaller boats. Don't know which one there was, but there's record of them saying that they had to wait for things to happen because the submarine fired its torpedo. And let's remember that the submarines were trying to destroy the British ships. And this one was fired at quite a distance. But the captain saw it, and he didn't try to avoid it. He just went on straight and let the German submarine realize that they were a sitting duck, that the Q5 was a sitting duck. Some of these ships had 4 names because they had a legal name, they had a secret name, and they had different names when they pulled into different ports to prove that they existed. If they were at Lloyd's of London or somewhere like that, they had another name on the ship. So whether you were left on the ship or in that small boat, one of the escape boats, you had to sit and wait. You didn't know what your fate was. You didn't know if you were going to get blown out of the water. You didn't know how long you would have to wait before the German sub surfaced. You were just waiting there with your pet parrot. They call them panic parties, because you had some of the men were dressed like women, and they did all sorts of things to throw off the enemy. When the enemy got close enough and surfaced, that's when they dropped the protection and pulled out the Maxim 20s and started firing on the submarine. The first encounter, they destroyed the submarine, and she was sinking slowly, but not fast enough. My grandfather wasn't on the ship when this happened. It was the first time they used a depth charge in warfare. They had used it in practice, but this is the first time they used it in warfare. And they blew the front off the sub, and she sank with no survivors. So Captain Gordon Campbell, figured that the best thing to do was let them even get closer. And he figured that the only thing to do was take a torpedo. You know, it's bad enough to be fired on with a torpedo and see that bubble coming towards you, the line of the bubbles, but he wanted to be hit, and he made sure that the ship that they were on, the Q5, which my grandfather was on now, would take the torpedo in the most harmless area. Some of the ships that were out there had lumber on board, they had casks on board with air in them, so they would stay buoyant even though they would get hit. So, but it took about almost a year before they came across the second submarine. And this one fired the torpedo. The Q5 took the torpedo, and they started to abandon ship as they did before. So now they knew that the submarine was going to be closer and quicker than the previous one that they had sunk. And she surfaced. They revealed the guns. They put up the white ensign to let them know they were a British warship, and they started firing. The first casualty was the captain of the submarine, and he was decapitated. The submarine started to go down again. I think about 8 men survived the sinking sub, but only 2 were rescued from the water. And this is around Ireland, South Ireland, and the Irish Sea around there. So 2 were rescued, and only 1 survived after the rescue to be brought back to Britain. So that was the time my grandfather from Herring Neck, Chesley Miles from Herring Neck, got any type of notoriety or whatever. They all got medals for what they did, and Chess was sent back to the Britain again, and then back to overseas again. They would do that, and then one of the last trips they sent him back was back to the Niobe, which was another British ship given to Canada, and it was in Halifax Harbor. And I wanted to get the dates right here. That he was on the 24th of November 17th, which was about how many days of that? 6 and 6, about 12 or 13 days before the Great Halifax explosion. And then when I started to read that postcard I gave you, on the back it talks about how he was blown off. He was strapping his razor, and how he was blown off the deck of the ship, the Niobe, and still survived. And I've got some articles here from different newspapers One of them comes from the Twillingate Sun. And the Twillingate Sun talks about how they took this man on board. They'd got him in Lewisport. They were bringing him back to Herring Neck, so the closest place would be get to Twillingate, and how they took care of him and gave him the royal treatment because he was still showing some of his injuries. And he got involved. I guess he recovered so much, and he married Alice Molan out of Musgrave Harbor, and they went to New York, to Brooklyn to live, and she got pregnant, and before their son was born, Ches was taken ill, and it looks like it was probably a piece of iron left from the explosions that he had been in, the sinkings and things like that, and he survived as long as he could, but he didn't survive long enough to see his son. And he died in Brooklyn about 4 months before his son was born. And I get a little emotional when I talk about this now, because Chesley Miles was my biological grandfather. Even though I was raised as a Windsor, my father was raised by his great aunt and uncle who were Windsors, but Chesley was his biological father. And I have his picture up there on the wall behind me, and there's lots more detail I could have gotten into, and it's very difficult for me to talk and keep it 10 or 15 minutes, because I could have kept you up here all day long, all night long listening. But I thank for the opportunity to share the story about Chesley Miles, my grandfather from Herring Neck. Thank you for listening and taking his story to your heart. Bless you.
War leaves scars that last long after the fighting ends. William Muse served with the Royal Newfoundland Regiment during World War I. And while he faced the horrors of battle, it was an invisible wound that truly changed his life. His son, Oral Muse, shares the heartbreaking story of how war took not just one life, but an entire family.
My name is Oral Muse, and this is a story my father, Henry Muse, told me. William Muse was from Birchie Bay, Notre Dame Bay, Newfoundland, and he served with the 1st Royal Newfoundland Regiment during the First World War. At one point, he was wounded. He was shot in the leg and taken to a hospital in London. Once there, the doctors quickly realized that his wounded leg was the least of his problems. William had contracted tuberculosis. They transferred him to the sanatorium at the hospital in St. John's, where he later died. Now, shortly before he was wounded, William had returned home on leave without knowing he had TB. His brother and sister caught it and were dead within 6 months. Eventually, his entire family was wiped out by tuberculosis. So while William may have managed to escape death on the battlefield, in the end, he brought death home with him.
Some soldiers are remembered for their bravery, others for their sacrifices. Lance Corporal John Shywok is remembered for both. Known for his exceptional skills as a marksman and his service as a proud Indigenous soldier. John's story is shared by his great-nephew Danny Pottle, highlighting his journey from Labrador to the battlefields of France and the recognition he earned later in life.
My name is Danny Pottle. I'm the great-nephew of Lance Corporal John Shywok. My great-uncle was touted to be one of the best snipers in the British Army during World War I. Uncle John was born in 1889, we believe, in the month of January, February, or March. We're not certain of the month. He's the eldest son of my paternal grandparents, John Shywok and Sarah Susanna Oliver. He was born just inside of Riglet, about 6 miles in Hamilton Inlet, in a little hamlet called Cul-de-sac. His early years, like many young boys and young men during that period, were spent learning the techniques and skills associated with hunting, trapping, fishing. It was a way of life. Riglet wasn't settled as a community during those days. It was a community, it was a post of the Hudson Bay Company where they collected salmon and traded furs with the local people in and around the Riglet area. Uncle John's early years were spent learning the skills associated with hunting, fishing, trapping. It was a way of life. There was not a lot of employment per se, other than the Hudson Bay Company. It was known that Uncle John, at around 11 years of age, went to work as a part-time employee with the Hudson Bay Company and with the missionaries associated with the International Grenfell Association. He also taught himself to read and write. He had no formal education per se. He also spent some time in his younger years working in the lumber industry in Mud Lake, which is near Goose Bay, for the Dickey Lumber Company. During that time, he met, I guess, and became associated with some members of the Legion of Canadian Frontiersmen. He became a member of that paramilitary organization, despite the fact that one of their criteria was not to accept members from men of the country per se, or indigenous people, natives that we would know them at the time. In 1911, Uncle John traveled to St. John's, which he paid for the trip with money that he had made from trapping during the winter of 1911. It was recorded that he had received $469 for trapping a silver fox. That was a considerable amount of money at the time. During that voyage, on the return home, he had met and befriended a Canadian adventurist by the name of William Lacey Amy. And mostly what we know about Uncle John's years during the time that he served in the Royal Newfoundland Regiment came through writings and correspondence that he had over the years with William Lacey Amy. We also know information about Uncle John from the records held by the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, the archives in St. John's Memorial University, by the writings of historians such as Frank Gogos, Bert Riggs, by way of example. And again, namely what we know of his years during the time that he served came from his friendship with William A.C. Amy. He provided Mr. Amy with a lot of his journals, a lot of his writings, poetry. He sketched and he painted in watercolors, and he also expressed an interest in becoming what he termed then as a soldier. He enlisted with the Royal Newfoundland Regiment as a member of the 6th Draft on July 25th, 1915. He spent about 3 or 4 months here before he was deployed overseas. He left here by train as far as Quebec City, then on to Montreal, caught the ship, the Corsican, I believe, into Devon, England, ended up in Ayr, Scotland for about 6 months before he was sent to and served in action in France. That was in about the fall of 1915. Given his ability and his record as a sniper, he was promoted to Lance Corporal on April 16, 1916. Uncle John died in the Battle of Cambrai on November 21st, 1917. During the second wave of the battle, during a cleanup reconnaissance mission, him and 7 other comrades died as a result of an errant German shell that exploded, killing him and 7 comrades and wounding about 10 others. He was buried very shortly after that on the same day near the village of Masneer, where the Battle of Cambrai was taking place. We know his remains lie underneath 16 meters of rubble under the parking lot of the Hofstetter School in Masneers. We know that we'll never recover his remains, but it gives us some peace of mind, I guess, for lack of a better word, that we know where his final resting place is. I've spent a lot of years advocating and lobbying for recognition of our Indigenous veterans, not only my uncle, given that our Indigenous people were not considered citizens of the country during World War I believe, like the government in Newfoundland and Labrador, believes that we were a country at the time, and our Indigenous veterans weren't recognized, they weren't honored, they weren't given the same benefits as other veterans who had served. They were left to their own devices. They were returned home without any support. And I think it's long overdue that their services and their sacrifices are recognized, honored, and commemorated. The city of Masneer has commemorated Uncle John by placing a plaque on the side of the Hofstetter School. That happened in 2023. The planning for that started in about 2018. It was supposed to initially happen in 2020, but of course COVID set in and that was delayed the project by 3 years. I've since continued my lobbying efforts and advocacy efforts with the province, and I've submitted a proposal to have my Uncle John commemorated on behalf of all Indigenous veterans who served the province of Newfoundland and Labrador during First World War, Second World War, the Korean Wars, current peacekeepers. I think their sacrifices should be honored just the same as others who are served. I've always considered my Uncle John and other Indigenous veterans unsung heroes of the war, and I think they should be recognized and honored the same as all other veterans have been.
War doesn't just impact soldiers. It also leaves an indelible mark on their families. For many Newfoundland and Labrador families during World War I, the fear of loss was constant. Martha Smith of Gooseberry Cove experienced this pain firsthand as she saw 4 of her sons and a grandson serve. Her story, shared through the research of Lester Green, is a testament to strength and sacrifice.
Known by many as the Great War, World War I took a tragic toll on many families throughout Newfoundland and Labrador. Some families paid a heavy toll, with more than one son enlisting with the Newfoundland Royal Naval Reserve. The constant worry by parents on the home front led to many stress-filled, restless nights. There were hours of prayers as the parents knelt by their bedside, praying for the safe return of their sons in many Newfoundland outports. Combine this with the loss of a husband and 4 sons who sailed out of St. John's Harbor in 1914, and you have one resilient mother. Martha Smith was such a mother from Gooseberry Cove. Today's story is entitled A Mother's Wartime Sacrifice by Lester Green. Many young men enlisted with the Royal Naval Reserve after the British government gifted to the colony of Newfoundland the Calypso in 1902. Converted at Placentia, then anchored in St. John's, where it served as a training vessel for the Royal Naval Reserve. Many young recruits saw the reserve as a potential source of income for their families who had little or no income. Traditionally, these men would walk, sail, or take a train to St. John's to secure a berth on a sealing vessel. If they failed to secure a berth, they returned home. The Royal Naval Reserve offered an opportunity to replace the lost income, enticing men to enlist. Numerous Newfoundland families had more than one son enlist with the Newfoundland Royal Naval Reserve. This map showing the communities that surround the shores of the Southwest Arm area where a number of men enlisted. In the Southwest Arm area alone, 21 families had more than one son enlisted. Martha Smith and Joseph had 5 sons enlist from the scenic fishing village of Gooseberry Cove, Trinity Bay. The community roots were entangled with the fishery dating back to the late 1600s. Martha and Joseph were married shortly before 1877 in a small school chapel that overlooked a picturesque, now abandoned community called Artsy's Beach. This beach could be best described as a tombolo, using a geographical term. It had a cobblestone beach that offered the early British merchants a means of drying codfish. This in turn was shipped back to European markets. Martha and Joseph were blessed with 7 sons and 2 daughters. The oldest sons were Moses Smith, seen in this photograph, and George Smith. At the present, there's been no photograph located of George. Her 4 sons, Luke, Roy, Benjamin, John, and Isaac John. Her youngest son, James, and her youngest daughter, Alice. Rachel had died at an early age. Martha's family was heavily impacted by the conflict that ravaged between 1914 and 1918. 4 of her sons, along with her grandson Isaac, enlisted with the Newfoundland Royal Naval Reserve. She had raised Isaac after his father and mother died. She considered him her son, and likewise Isaac thought of her as his mother. On his naval application in 1918, Isaac listed her as his mother and his uncle as his brothers. Losing her husband 2 months after witnessing her 4 sons sailing from St. John's Harbour would have caused many of us feel abandoned by God, but Martha's faith was strong. She had to be brave and not show weakness in front of her children that were still at home with her. Her granddaughter, Minnie Ryan, explains, "Grandmother was a very religious woman. She would pray constantly for the safe return of her sons while holding and rubbing her crucifix that Martha had received from her parents at a very young age. There's a photograph of the crucifix that hung on the wall at the retirement home where I had interviewed Minnie Ryan. She was given the crucifix by her grandmother. Minnie went on to explain, grandmother took comfort in knowing that 3 children were still at home, James, Isaac, and Alice. The first son to enlist was Luke in March 1906. He was followed by John in March 1909. Roy enlisted in February 1910, and Benjamin in March 1914. All 4 sons departed St. John's around the same time, but Roy was assigned to the Royal Canadian Navy ship Niobe. Between them, her boys had already provided 18 years of service to the Newfoundland Royal Naval Reserve. War is never a pleasant experience, and the potential for tragedy always lurks in its shadows. For the family, the drowning of Luke on board the HMS Laurentic off Loch Swilly created a vivid image of Aura that was forever etched in their memories. The ship struck 2 minefields and sank within 20 minutes in a raging January storm, taking 354 passengers to their watery graves. Among them, 22 sailors from the Newfoundland Royal Naval Reserve. Luke's wife, Isabel, would never see her husband again. Their infant daughter, Viola, would never get the opportunity to snuggle and feel the warm embrace of her father's arms. In 2016, there was a wreath-laying ceremony off Loch Swilly where the ship went down. In this photo, Don McNeil points to a board that's now permanently displayed in the museum, telling Luke's story. The Great Halifax Explosion occurred on December the 6th, 1917, 11 months after the death of Luke. Martha was unaware that 2 of her sons, Ben and John, were present at the port of Halifax. Ben had just completed his leave at home, comforting his mother over the loss of her son, Luke. He was aboard the HMCS Niobe at Halifax, waiting for passage overseas. John was assigned to the Royal Canadian Navy and was working at the naval base in Halifax. Both brothers narrowly escaped with their lives, but witnessed the absolute aura and shock of exploding munitions on the carnage of human life. For Martha, the final burden of stress came with the enlistment of her grandson, Isaac, on May 3rd, 1918. On his naval application, Isaac had noted that his mother's name was Martha and that he had 3 brothers presently serving in the Naval Reserve, John, Benjamin, and Uriah. Martha was so distraught by his decision that the family history records that she wrote to the Naval Admiralty at HMS Britain, St. John's, explaining that the Royal Naval Reserve already had 4 of her sons, one of which was lost to the sea. She requested that Isaac be kept away from the dangerous waters and remain patrolling the waters off Newfoundland. Isaac Naval Records indicates that the Admiralty listened and showed compassion towards a distraught naval mother. Isaac remained assigned to the HMS Britain for all of his naval career. Family members of her youngest son, James, also claims that she requested that the Admiralty not accept any application for his enlistment. 3 of her sons, along with her grandson, returned safely to Newfoundland after the war. She could once again be comforted by the presence of her complete family. Uriah moved to the United States shortly after marrying Janet Baker, a teacher from Fogo. They never returned to Newfoundland. John married Dinah Pitcher in 1913 and settled in Sunnyside. Isaac married Rose Breaker, a girl that was in service in Gooseberry Cove at the time, and they eventually settled in Deer Lake, where he remained until his death in 1965. Ben married Mary Jane Lambert in 1919, but she succumbed to kidney failure in 1921. He remarried in 1924 to Eliza Iscock of Hodges Cove and settled in Illview. This photograph shows Martha and her friend Phoebe. After the war, Martha lived for another 21 years and enjoyed her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She often said without hesitation that she had 5 sons who served their country during the Great War. We know that the 5th was her grandson, but she died saying that there were 5 sons who served, showing her strong commitment to family and all that she believed family entailed. After the war, Martha spoke the following words: "I hope that I never live to see and worry about another world war." Ironically, she died on September the 1st, 1939, the day that the Second World War began. Thank you for listening to the story about a mother's wartime sacrifice.
War stories are often about battles, but at their heart, they are personal tales of love and loss. Today, we share a remarkable love story from World War I. A young Newfoundland soldier, bound for the front lines, finds love with a talented pianist. But as war looms, fate takes an unexpected turn, leading to a daring act that could have changed everything.
And so my grandfather, being a simple fisherman from Newfoundland, basically at the age of 29 decided he was going to go over and do his duty for king and country. And he went to, initially he had to be trained and whatnot. And so he went to, I think, under Florizella, I'm not sure where, I think they might have landed in Southampton, and from there took a train up to Edinburgh. But he basically did most of his training. The little bit that he did here was pretty rudimentary, because there's a need to go overseas, and they had the regiment, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, asked for volunteers, and so they gave him some broom handles to march around with and send him overseas to face something they had no idea what they're getting into. And so they finished their training in Edinburgh Castle area in Edinburgh, Scotland, and they were billeted in Edinburgh Castle. And so my grandfather, at the age of 29, with a bunch of his buddies from the Southern Shore, there's a lot of young men that went over with him on the Florizel, and a lot of them didn't come back. If I mention Beaumont Hamel, you'll understand what I mean by that, because most of the Newfoundland Regiment was wiped out in Beaumont Hamel, and my grandfather survived it, and I'll come back to that. So basically, he's overtraining in Edinburgh Castle. He's 29 years old, and being a young man in a big city, he's left Fairland, Newfoundland, which had no electricity. He came from a house that was had no indoor plumbing and whatnot, and he goes to this beautiful capital city of Edinburgh, and he meets this beautiful young girl who was 10 years younger than him, and so she was 18 or 19 at the time. I don't know how they met, and I should know that, and I'm trying to find that out, because that's part of the love story, and it is a love story I'm telling you. I'm not telling you a war story, I'm telling you a love story. And he met this beautiful girl who was able to play the piano so well that when she played, people would come from all around to hear her at the age of 18 and 19. And that's the most personal information I know about her, because she died when I was very, very young, and I'll come back to that. So he meets this wonderful girl and trained for several months in Edinburgh Castle, and then they were planning on shipping him out to the war zone. And so he had met a girl there. I was telling you that she was a good pianist and whatnot, and they fell in love. And they actually planned on getting married before he shipped away. And a lot of young ladies and men, I think, facing the possibility of dying, who were in love, I think want to have the intensity of a real relationship that's not bound by the cold straps of society norms. They want to be really intimate, and they may never see each other again. So a lot of them got married, and then they were separated for years while they were fighting. And so they planned to get married, and about two days before the wedding date, he gets confined to barracks in Edinburgh Castle because they're shipping out, and it turned out to be Gallipoli. So he went to Gallipoli, where everybody knows how bad Gallipoli was. And so here he was, not able to tell his bride, not able to see his bride, and she's going to go to the church and wait for him, and he's not going to be there. And she's going to think that he's jilted her, and she's going to be destroyed, and he can't live with that, and he knows she can't live with that. So he does what any young man in love will do. He does the right thing. He scaled down Edinburgh Castle wall, went AWOL, risking being shot for desertion, being court-martialed, being labeled a traitor. All of those he risked. Scaled down Edinburgh Castle wall, got married, and went back the same night. I don't think he had a wedding night at that point. And went back, scaled up Edinburgh Castle wall, and didn't see his missus until he came back from the next big battle that he was involved in, which was the Battle of the Somme, and in 1916, in July 1st, the Newfoundland Regiment was almost decimated. There was something like 900 and something young men went over the top, and about 68 returned, and my grandfather was one of them. And I bumped into later on in life, in my 40s or 30s, I bumped into a guy who told me my grandfather actually had saved his father, who had gone over with the Newfoundland soldiers, and my grandfather brought him back on his shoulder from the hell, the 15 minutes of hell that wiped them all out. So you can imagine what a brave act that was. So he's in Beaumont Hamel, survives that, and 2 weeks later, he comes down with pneumonia and trench fever, and rheumatic fever, and gets so sick, he's in hospital for months, and then finally shipped back to Newfoundland via Edinburgh because he's too weak to be a soldier anymore. And so he comes back to Newfoundland with his bride. So it might have been the best thing that ever happened to him, getting pneumonia and nearly dying, because there was 2 more years of hell, and the death rate, as you know, was incredible. And so pneumonia might have saved his life, and I wouldn't be here if he didn't have pneumonia. Anyway, so this bride leaves Edinburgh with her lover, my grandfather, and come back to Fairland, Newfoundland. They had 8 children, and after about 10 years of marriage, my grandfather, being a fisherman and not having a lot of money, realized that his true love had family back in Scotland, and he wanted her to go back to Scotland. He couldn't afford to go himself, but he wanted her to go back to Scotland to see her family. So he saved up enough money for 10 years that he bought her a ticket, or he gave her the money to buy a ticket, put it that way, from a boat leaving St. John's, which will go to Halifax, and from Halifax to Southampton, and then finally up to Edinburgh to see her family. So she gets on a coastal boat in Fairland, which came once every 2 weeks or something, and goes around the island and finally into St. John's, where they were transferred to a bigger boat like the Florizel. So she goes to St. John's, and he's thinking that she's gone to Scotland. And 2 weeks later, he's surprised when the coastal boat comes in the Fairland Harbour. And on this coastal boat is this beautiful bride of his who never went to Scotland, but instead spent all her money on a grand piano that was so big they had to take the side of the house out to put it into the house. In any event, she was so good on the piano that apparently, and I'm told this, and I believe it because her daughter Phyllis was gifted on the piano as well. And she was so good on the piano that I'm told that members of the Ayres and the Barrings and whatnot would go by horse and buggy from St. John's or coastal boat up to Fairland to hear her play. So she must have been pretty darn good. Unfortunately, she died young, and I was only 1 year old when she died, so I never got to meet her. But so time is passing, and another 10 years go by. Now they have a bit of improvement in Fairland. I'm not sure if they still had electricity, but the roads were better, et cetera, et cetera. But they still had the coastal boat. And so again, he saved up enough money to send her. And this time he said, "Now you go home, you see her family." And he insisted that she not spend it on herself and whatnot. So this time, she's gone a little bit longer. She's gone about 3 weeks this time, so he's really convinced she's gone to Scotland. But guess what? She arrived in Fairland again, not by coastal boat, but in a car. She had bought a car, I think it was probably a Model T or something like that, and set up the first taxi service in Fairland, learned to drive it, and set up a taxi service. And in those days, the roads were so narrow, it was one-way traffic, and if you met someone would have to back up probably a half a mile to be able to pass each other. That's how bad the roads were. But she became a taxi driver in Fairland. So it goes to show you that God looks after us all in one way or another if we're good people. I really believe that.
And that concludes the first episode of our Unsung Heroes, World War I stories from Newfoundland and Labrador. We've heard powerful accounts of the bravery and determination of those who served, and the turmoil and worry of those who remained at home and awaited their return. It's important that we continue to honor their memory. A heartfelt thank you to our interviewees for sharing their stories, those who did the hard work of finding these stories, and to all of you for joining us. These are the stories of our past that deserve to be remembered. Be sure to join us next time for the second part of this special series, as we continue to pay tribute to the men and women who gave so much during the Great War. St. John's storytelling gratefully acknowledges the Perlin Family Trust and the Year of the Arts through Arts NL for funding this special project. We also acknowledge our partners in this project, MUN, the Royal Canadian Legion, and Rogers Cable. We dedicate this project to the memory of Dr. Rob Shea, who helped plant the seeds of the project before his sudden passing. These stories are but a small part of his lasting legacy.
We want to hear from you. Provide feedback on this show or find out how you can get involved. Call, email us, or scan the QR code to take our quick survey.
With clubs, leagues, and courts in every province and territory across Canada, squash is the sport for wall-to-wall fun, fitness, and friendship. From coast to coast to coast. Learn to play and you'll want to do it every day. Squash. Play inside the box.
The battlefields of World War I may be distant, but their echoes still resonate through the families and communities of those who served. Each soldier, nurse, and volunteer had a story, stories of bravery, sacrifice, and resilience that have been passed down through generations. Welcome to Our Unsung Heroes, World War I stories from Newfoundland and Labrador. In this episode, we continue our journey through history, hearing from the families of those who fought and others who have chosen to preserve these important stories. Through their voices, we honor the memories of the men and women who gave so much, ensuring that their sacrifices are never forgotten. Join us as we uncover more of the untold stories of Newfoundland and Labrador's unsung heroes. Some war stories are about battles and medals, but others are defined by friendship, sacrifice, and loyalty. Today, we share the story of two young men from Labrador, whose bond carried them through the trenches of Europe and back home. Their courage and kindness left a lasting legacy, one passed down through generations. Jan Hardy shares their remarkable journey with us now.
Our mom, who hails from Cartwright, Labrador, is always very proud of her Labrador heritage. And she always made sure that we knew who our grandfather was, though we'd never met him. Mom's dad died when she was just 14, 15 years old. And it was very important to her that we know just what kind of guy he was. And she always, when she spoke of him, she prefaced it with, he was a soldier in the war. He was in the Great World War. And we were only children, and she really wanted us to know that. So about 8 years ago, I came here to care for Mom. She was going through dementia in her later years. And when I came into the porch, she had put grandfather's picture up in the porch. And it was always a part of our lives, but now it was front and center. She put him in the porch, and written on the frame in big, heavy black marker was, this is my father. And the Great World War, and she had poppies put on it, and I guess it was a reminder to her as well, but she wanted everybody to know that. She wanted everybody to know about her dad. And through the years, our cousins in Labrador, and we've shared stories, and we've read stories in them days, and there is the story of my grandfather going off to war. For starters, he got back to Sandwich Bay, to White Bear River is where grandfather was from working a little further north with Mr. White. And upon returning back to Cartwright, he found that his good friend, and actually second or third cousin, Silas Bird, had enlisted in the war. He was gone. And grandfather knew that you had to be between the ages of 16 and 30. And hey, Silas was 32 years old. How did he get to go? So grandfather lied about his age, said he was 29, so that he'd be sure to go. And he left. He got on the second boat from Labrador. And they met. Silas and Manuel met over in England and in the training camp. And they were part of a contingent of quite a few Labrador men who went to fight in the First World War. Grandfather's number, 1931, R&R, Royal Newfoundland Regiment. And the story goes, they, of course, they were part of many battles, but in France, Silas was injured. He was shot so that he wasn't able to move. He was shot in the chest and in the hands. And my grandfather went out at night to get him. And he dragged him, though Silas told him, "You're just going to kill yourself. You're going to get killed yourself. Leave me here." He said, "Well, I got to bring you back." And he brought Silas to safety. And here I am getting emotional, but grandfather, through the years, through the 4.5 years or 5 years, whatever it was they were over there, grandfather was injured 3 times. He was shot in the forearm and had to convalesce in a hospital in England, and he got better. He was a sniper in the war, and a good shot from Labrador, and he was injured again. The second injury took part of his ear, and he again recovered in a hospital in England. And I read the war records, and each time they say no disability. You know, someone's shot in the arm, someone's got their ear shot off, and then he was injured again, and his ring finger had to be amputated. Silas's injuries took him off the battlefield, and he worked in the offices in London, and these guys were just, you know, people of the war who had no way to really connect with home. I read one story where he tried to get 10 pounds sent home to his father for Christmas, and trying to get the people in London or wherever to realize how difficult it would be to get a message sent to Labrador. He was explaining that it's not like sending a message to St. John's, and I guess that was all part of it. When they returned back to St. John's at the same time, Silas and Manuel, and got back to Labrador and started their lives. They became family men. They had families. Silas married Jessie, and Manuel was his best man at the wedding. And then Manuel went on to have 6 children with my grandmother, May. And when my mom was 14, she described it as the saddest Christmas of their lives. They got the news that their dad was going to die. He was gravely ill, and probably due to gases that he had been part of in the war. He had a severe liver disease, and anyways, Silas would always listen to the news. They lived in different communities. Silas in White Bear River and grandfather in Cartwright. And he heard the news that Manuel was sick, and he told his family, he said, "There's a good man. It's because of him that I'm here." And it was just a short while later in March that my grandfather passed away. And the story goes, the Bird family told my cousins that Silas normally would come out and have supper after he listened to the news. And he heard that Manuel had passed, and he stayed in his room all night. He sat in the dark and lamented the loss of his good friend. And leading up to this, my grandfather had prepared to build a house in Cartwright, a nicer house for his family. He had all the wood ready and windows bought, everything ready for. And Silas built the house for grandmother, and my mom were able to live in a nice home in Cartwright because Silas did this for his friend. So there you go. How could that story not be told? It's a very heartwarming story of two very strong and brave people. And yeah, and it was important for me to tell it because my mom would want people to know that story. It's a Labrador story, and it was very important to her.
Some places may fade from maps, but they never fade from memory. The people of Sound Island may have left their home nearly a century ago, but they carried their history with them, their stories, their traditions, and even the very soil beneath their feet. Dennis Flynn takes us on a journey to Sound Island, where a simple act of remembrance, bringing back a handful of earth for an elder's roses, reveals a powerful connection to the past.
My name is Dennis Flynn. I am from Colliers, Newfoundland and Labrador, and in August of 2024 I had a great privilege to join some friends of mine, Lisa and Doug, as they were going on a kayaking trip to Sound Island in Placentia Bay. Now, I've been to Sound Island before, kayaking and visiting nearby Woody Island and some of the other islands in Placentia Bay, but this was a rather unique and interesting opportunity. Doug informed me that his people, as he called them, his ancestors had left Sound Island nearly a century ago, and he'd never been back there personally. However, in his family, he has, I believe, a great aunt, and she's well into her 90s, and a charming lady, and she told Doug that when their relatives left Sound Island, they took with them roses that were grown on Sound Island. And she said, "Doug, I know you've never been over there, but if you get a chance, promise me that when you go, you'll go and bring back some soil from Sound Island so that these roses can grow again in their native soil." Now, I thought that was an absolutely fabulous idea. What a wonderful romantic notion to return and gather the soil for this older lady so that she could grow her roses in that very same earth, the rich earth of Sound Island, after 100 years. So off we went. We left nearby Garden Cove, and it's only a short crossing. You can actually see Sound Island from the Garden Cove wharf, and we made a day of it. We landed and located approximately the community where Doug's people would have come from, and we gathered up our soil, and then we went on and we leapfrogged from cove to cove, and we'd go ashore and explore some old homesteads and all of these beautiful docks and paths and foundations of old homes. And it was a lovely, lovely, lovely afternoon. As we were getting near the end of the evening, I just mentioned to Doug, I said, "Doug, I wonder where was the church for these particular folks? And he said, Dennis, you know, I've heard that it was taken off of Sound Island and it was relocated to Garden Cove. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. During the era of resettlement, it certainly wasn't unusual for houses to be taken off all of these hauntingly beautiful islands in Placentia Bay and moved to places like Garden Cove and Swift Current and Arnold's Cove and Come by Chance and things of that nature. Church is not so much, not quite as common of a thing. And I had an occasion about a month later to be in Garden Cove early in the morning by myself. And so I'm going to look for that church. And sure enough, I did. And I found a beautiful little church. It was sitting there in the center of Garden Cove. And I said, wow, this has got to be it. And sure enough, it was. They have a plaque on there now saying that it's the Memorial United Church of Garden Cove, built there in September of 1956 in its new location. They even have a beautiful bell there as well that came off of Sound Island. The bell was made by McShane Foundry out of Baltimore, Maryland. In 1892, it's even got what I took to be a serial number or perhaps a model number on it. That's serial number 251, if you're looking, if you like those type of things. So obviously, the people of Sound Island, very precise, very methodical, very much a long view of history. They took with them things that were important when they left. As I was about to go, I noticed this beautiful white stone monument. It's a war memorial, but an interesting one. I went over and I had a look at it, and just two names on it and inscriptions to them. And they read, in loving memory of Private Angus Brinston of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, who was killed in action in France, August 16, 1917, aged 18 years. Their name liveth forevermore. The second memorial read, in loving memory of Lance Corporal Alfred Stacey, MM, of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment, who was killed in action in France, January 20th, 1918, aged 25 years. What can I give, O soldier true and brave, long as I live, to pay the life you gave? At the bottom of the monument, there was something else, and I almost missed it. And I went back and had a closer look, and it simply said, erected by the people of Sound Island. Now, I didn't know whether they meant that once the church came here, former residents of Sound Island erected this monument, or was it erected on Sound Island and moved over? So I decided to find out, and I contacted a lovely gentleman out in Sunny Cove by the name of Eric Beck. And Mr. Beck, charming gentleman with a great memory, and he informed me that he was a boy when, living in the Swift Current area when the church came over. And he said, yes, indeed, I do remember all about that. He said, my relatives worked on that project, and they dismantled the church, took it across, put it up in this new location, and away they went. They did also take the bell. And when I got to the monument, I said, Mr. Beck, did they take their war monument with them? And he never even hesitated. He said, of course they took their war monument. They wouldn't leave their boys behind. They wouldn't leave their boys behind. What else could you say? In times of relocation and leaving everything that's dear to a community, it would be very easy to say there are things we can take and things that we do indeed have to leave behind. Clearly, for the people of Sound Island, they took things that were important to them. They took their homes, They took their church, and they took their war monument. They were not going to leave their boys behind. Even though the corporal remains of the soldiers of Sound Island lay somewhere in the killing fields of France, very much they would always remain a part of Sound Island. So they are forever more attached to this beautiful place. And there's a philosophical question one could ask. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it fall, does it make a sound? Same thing can be said of remembrance. If they had left the monument behind and no one visited, would their boys be remembered? The people of Sound Island thought not. They made sure that where goeth the people of Sound Island, so goeth their boys. I was there that morning by myself, of course, and no words were spoken. Yet very much like the namesake of their home island, everything about the story of the moving monument resounded with a crystal clear sound.
When we think of Newfoundland and Labrador's contributions to World War I, our minds often go to the brave men of the Royal Newfoundland Regiment. But there's another side to this history, one that's less told, but just as vital. Terry Bishop Sterling, a history professor at Memorial University, shares the stories of the Newfoundland and Labrador women who served overseas, not on the battlefield, but in the hospitals, ambulances, and aid stations, saving lives in the midst of war.
So I want to tell a story about some of the Newfoundland and Labrador women who served overseas during World War I as nurses or nurses' aides, as ambulance drivers, as hospital attendants, domestics in the hospitals. We know of I know of at least 18 Newfoundland trained nurses. Those are nurses who went through a 3-year professional training program. And at least 46 Newfoundland women who served as VADs. I'll explain what that is in a minute. I've heard people say that there were as many as 200, but these are the women who I can identify. The 200 undoubtedly include Newfoundland women who were living at the time in Britain or Canada or the United States or somewhere else who signed up from there. But these are the women that I know a little bit about. Just a little bit of a definition. VAD, common term used, stands for Voluntary Aid Detachment. And that was an organization founded in Britain in 1909 with the idea to recruit women who could serve in civilian hospitals in time of war, leaving the trained professional nurses to serve in the military hospitals. And that was the original idea. But of course, the war was supposed to be over by Christmas. By 1916, the British were recruiting women to serve in military hospitals and at the front, that is, untrained women. VADs were usually given about 6 weeks first aid training, St. John ambulance training. And they went on to, as they serve in Britain in hospitals, and some of them at the front. The sources for this are fragmentary, particularly on the nurses, the trained nurses, and I'd love to know more of their stories. Partly that may be a class thing, that a lot of these women came back and they continued to work and who had time to write down their memories. But I think a lot of it is sort of a professional ethic, that they were doing their job, what they were trained to do, and didn't tend to write about it as much as the VADs, the voluntary women, who tended to be often from a slightly higher class. I don't see that difference being as big in Newfoundland as it was in Britain or Canada. In Britain, it did cause some problems, where you'd see these great ladies come to volunteer, and then they were told to, scrub the floors, and they weren't too happy. That wasn't a particular issue here. But we do have a little bit more from the VADs, and particularly I'm drawing on two collections which are held at the archives at Memorial University. One is from Fanny Cluett, and many people have probably seen the book, Your Daughter Fanny, which is an edited collection of her letters, which was edited by Bill Romke and Bert Riggs quite a few years ago. The other collection is the Sybil Johnson collection. That's a much larger collection, which I'm working on, have been working on with my friend Dr. Heidi Coombs for a few years now. And there's over 300 letters in that collection. So we'll draw on those a little bit, and then there's little bits and pieces, fragments of letters, and in one case, a memoir from a VAD that we can draw on. But the sources, unfortunately, are somewhat limited. Fanny Cluett, as I said, we have her letters. There we have about 24 letters, so, a very rich but small collection. She was from a leading family from Bellorum, a family of fishermen, merchants, boat builders. At the time of when the war started, she was a very mature 33-year-old woman. She was a teacher. She was very much her own person, a little older than some of the young women that signed up. And she was a very steady kind of woman. She wasn't very long in England before I think that was recognized, and she was one of the VADs who served at the front. She served at a hospital in Rouen, or military hospital, base camp. We have 24 of her letters. She served from 1916 to 1920 in England, France, and near the end of the war in Constantinople. Born in 1887, Sybil Johnson was the daughter of a Supreme Court judge. So very privileged young woman. She had studied at a finishing school in Britain and studied music in Germany. She was a very accomplished violinist. At the time of the war, she was contributing to a lot of fundraising the first couple of years of the war by usually using her musical talent. And she was engaged to an up-and-coming young lawyer, Brian Dunfield, who went on to make quite a name in Newfoundland. She was a very dutiful daughter and wrote to her parents. Some days she wrote, even after a long day at work, to both her mother and her father separately. And she served for a little over 18 months at a military hospital in Liverpool. Because of the requirements of nursing school, as I say, both the VADs and the nurses tended to be from the professional merchant classes, a little bit, higher class classes. At the time of the war, there were women all over Newfoundland who wrote in saying that they would like to help. Most of them ended up helping from home through fundraising and different patriotic causes at home. And there's a very practical reason for that, and then that they really could not afford, or their families could not afford, to lose their labor, particularly when often their brothers were gone off to serve. So you had to be able to, leave home and work for a couple of years for nothing. So that kind of dictated the kinds of women who could serve. Now, why did they serve? There certainly, I think a lot of them were looking for adventure. That could have been part of it. But most of the sources really support the findings in Britain and Canada and Australia and everywhere, that most of them felt it was their patriotic duty. Many of them followed fiancés, brothers, boyfriends, friends, cousins. Jeanette Coltis, for example, was discouraged by her mother and her employer, who was working as a shop clerk in St. John's at the time. And she was discouraged from going, but saw no reason why she should not follow her fiancé overseas. For graduate nurses, caring for men in war was at the very foundation of their profession. Back to Florence Nightingale in the Crimea. Mary Southcott, the founder and director of the School of Nursing here, which was really not very old by the time the war started. I think there may be only been 2 graduating classes. She gave a talk in 1915 and read from letters of British nurses serving and outlined the requirements to serve overseas. She trained at least 13 of the 18 nurses who I've identified who served in the Great War. Recalling her time as a nurse overseas, Bertha Forsey said she did it with Miss Southcott's encouragement. So she was a very influential person. Sybil Johnson also stressed duty as her main reason for enlisting. She often said, "I could not bear to have been a slacker." Great World War I word. She followed her brother and no less than 15 cousins overseas. And she served for 18 months. Neither her father nor her fiance were very keen on that. They thought she would serve her first time of 6 months and be back home, but she enlisted for 2 more times after that, so she was about 18 months in service. She was a very romantic kind of young woman and wrote poetry, and she maintained this sort of romantic view, particularly of soldiers, despite all the suffering she saw. And she was annoyed throughout the war that Brian did not enlist. She wrote to her mother, "You don't know how I long to hear that Brian is coming over, though I shall be scared stiff, needless to say. But it is no use. A soldier is the only man who counts nowadays among the physically fit." While a sense of duty and sentimental patriotism may have been her main reason for enlisting, her letters also reveal some uncertainty and dissatisfaction with her life. She boasted about her good health there, and she said she was never really as frail, as delicate as people thought. She was just feeling useless at home. Johnson went on to, as I said, to serve for 18 months, and most of the time she felt very strong physically, mentally, emotionally throughout the war. Late in the war, just before she finished her 3rd term, she became ill and tired and cranky. You start to see her complain a lot more. But again, she was quite ill and was hospitalized just before she came home. I think this may have been a very early wave of the Spanish flu because she was quite ill. By the spring of 1918, a combination of exhaustion, illness, and a new unpleasant supervisor, and pressure from home, for sure, saw her resume her life much as she had left it. Many historians have written about the clash between VADs and nurses, and particularly in Britain. This was a big deal because, as I say, the VADs were often, certainly socially, much above the more middle class and lower middle class nurses. But I don't think it was as big a problem here. They were from a very similar class. Many of them knew each other. If you read through the British Journal of Nursing in the First World War, which I have done, nurses at that point in Britain were really fighting for their professional status. They were trying to get a nursing registry. And so all of a sudden along come these, upper class women with 6 weeks training, and the public were praising them so much. The men referred to them as nurse. And so there was some resentment. But as the war continued, most of these nurses were very glad for the help that they got from the VADs. Nurse Bertha Forsey, the Newfoundland nurse, she described the women who served under her as great girls and said they really couldn't have managed without them. Throughout most of her service, Sybil Johnson got along well with her nursing supervisors, but she was the only one that I saw where you saw this sort of class kind of rivalry and complaints. And as I say, it was towards the end. She rarely complained that a task was beneath her, and she got along well with most of her supervisors. But she really chafed at what she saw as needless rules, and she did not like cold treatment, being treated, as she very tellingly said, like a servant. This was a young woman who was used to servants at home. After she returned from her last leave in the spring of 1918, Johnson's complaints increased. The new matron forbade music on the ward, and that really annoyed her because the men had enjoyed her musical talent. She loved playing the piano for them, or her fiddle, as she called it, or violin. And then she got on the bad side of a ward sister. And so there you could see her kind of class snobbery come through in this one letter to her mother when she wrote. The sisters, word for nurses, the sisters, most of them, like to pretend that VADs are practically servants because most of us are what they would consider grand in their natural sphere of life. And they really are fearfully jealous if any of us play or sing. They think that the officers are something grand and just dread their being nice to us. Matron thinks we have all come nursing with the fixed intention of ensnaring one of these young gods. Such outbursts certainly illustrate that class tension, but it's important to note that this was not typical of Johnson, as I've said. By the spring of 1918, she seems to have reached the end of her rope, and her letters are filled with references to counting the days, reclaiming her independence, and planning her new life with Brian. Neither Jeanette Coltis nor Frances Cluett complained about the unfair treatment by nurses. But their sources, in Cluett's case, only 24 letters. In Coltis's case, a nostalgic reminiscence written 40 years after the fact. They're hard to compare to this dailiness of Sybil Johnson's experience. If we had more from these women, we'd have a more nuanced picture of them, of the women that they served with, and of their experiences. So they had to adjust to new levels of authority, both sort of hospital authority and military authority. But of course, that was not the most difficult adjustments. Newfoundland nurses who served overseas with the British forces spent some time in military hospitals in Britain before any of them went to the front. And this likely provided a very necessary interlude and transition. Bertha Forsey spent 2 years at Catterick Military Hospital in Yorkshire before being sent to France. At Catterick, she assisted in operating rooms, treated German prisoners of war, and cared for servicemen suffering from shell shock. Catterick was particularly known for that. Her reminiscence is told in a professional, matter-of-fact way, which was often typical of the way nurses wrote about their experience. But she took pride in the new skills she learned, including training in anesthesia. That's one of the things that many nurses did receive special training in during the war. Similarly, Nurse Maisie Parsons, a Newfoundland woman who served with Canadian services in Belgium, described the wounds she saw as dreadful but interesting. So while nurses were certainly empathetic to their patients, their training helped them to maintain a certain emotional distance. That was part of their training as nurses. And their work could bring the satisfaction, certainly, of being trusted with greater responsibility than they would have had so quickly at home as some of them fairly recent graduates. Even for nurses, however, the continuous stream of maimed and dying young men must have been hard to take. For VADs who'd come to do domestic work and soothe the brows of bedridden soldiers, the adjustment to the horrors of war must have been even worse. They worked up to 12-hour shifts with a couple of hours off each day. Their experience varied. They wrote letters and shopped for the men. They performed basic housekeeping duties to free up the nurses. They helped with dressings and sometimes even assisted at operations. Frances Cluett also mentions simply, or not so simply, being expected to sit with dying men. Both Cluett and Johnson made particular mention of their first time assisting with dressings. For Cluett, it might have been a little bit too quick. It was about 5 days after she started serving at the hospital in Lincoln, and she fainted. She never again wrote that she fainted, and she was very embarrassed by it, but she said she did have to turn her head away a few times. Johnson wasn't asked to help with dressing until she had been on the ward for 3 months. And she described in a letter to her mother and father being on the trolley with sister. And she felt she had performed well, but some dressings were harder than others. She recounted helping with the dressing for a man with a fractured spine. The experience prompted feelings of both horror and pride, and you see this constantly in these letters, how horrific everything was, but how proud they were to help. She wrote, "The man had sores all down his back, and it was altogether a fearful and repulsive business. I hadn't much to do but hold him steady when I helped turn him over on his side. He was a Scotchman, and so game and plucky, and kept talking away to me, and held my arm with his hand, which was like a firebrand. He had a high temp. In a way, I was glad to help, but it was horrible." She later found it very hard to watch as this man died with his wife and young daughter by his side. Another time she describes, going off to the bathroom after helping with a wound, and what she's describing, the sort of shaking all over, sounds very much like a panic attack. Apart from difficult medical work, nurses would have also been accustomed to performing very personal services for their patients. The young, well-bred women of the VAD would not have been exposed to such tasks, and some found this almost as hard to deal with as the dressings. Ideally, military hospitals in both England and at the front had male orderlies to bathe men, deal with bedpans, administer other personal things considered not quite proper for a young woman. For Johnson, bathing the men and dealing with bedpans was one of the worst parts of the job. While the matter-of-fact Cluett mentions giving a bed baths just matter-of-factly as part of a general description of a day's work, Johnson was horrified. Occasionally, all the orderlies were called up or reassigned, a practice Johnson complained about bitterly. In April 1917, she explained to her mother that since the orderlies were gone, all sorts of appalling jobs fall on us, and truly I can't face it. You know my leaning to primness. One of the things I found interesting is that she wrote to her father the same day. She didn't talk about that at all. Remember, her father didn't want her over there. Instead, she filled her letter up with, some of the comic antics of some of the patients. She claimed to adjust to this and to be able to hide her discomfort from the men. But she never really liked it. When she learned in June that her ward would be getting a male orderly, she announced it in a letter with, "I burst with joy." Living conditions and the work itself was harder the closer to the front. Cluett, as I said, served in France, and she did not have the professional training of Maisie Parsons or Bertha Forsey. So in Rouen, she had to draw on all of her personal strength to help her, and to help her patients, and to preserve some peace for herself. On her second day there, she helped with a very bad dressing. She wrote to her mother, "There was one man wounded in the thigh. There was a hole right through from side to side. It was like you cut it with an axe. You can read about war and the wounded, but when you are brought face to face with it, I tell you, it is heartrending." In Rouen, she also saw the immediate effects of poison gas. Cluett's remarkably candid letters from France lack both the professional distance of some of the trained nurses and the sort of more positive, nostalgia-looking tone of something like Jeanette Coltis's Reminiscence. VAD work was not all stress and sadness. Both Johnson and Cluett talk about parties on the ward, concerts, particularly at Christmas. They enjoyed shopping for the men, getting them little treats. They relied on family and friends for companionship and waited anxiously for mail from home. They also drew comfort from their passions: poetry and music for Johnson, photography, painting, and gardening for Cluett. Cluett painted scenes around her hospital camp, and she planted a garden to brighten her surroundings. She even sent home a slip from a rose bush that she had planted, maybe in an attempt to preserve this remarkable period of her life. Even at their lowest times, Johnson and Clewett were clearly glad that they had come. During her last few unhappy weeks in Liverpool, Johnson asserted that she never could have forgiven herself if she had shirked her duty and stayed at home. For Clewett, the last month of the war became even worse, and the horror that surrounded her increased. In March and April 1918, German bombers struck several hospitals and casualty clearing stations, increasing the load on the rest. Her hospital became, in effect, a clearing station. Patient numbers increased dramatically, and men would come without even an initial dressing of their wounds. She didn't complain about her work, but she worried that the staff simply couldn't keep up. She wrote, "Boys are dying for want of attention. They cannot be attended to before being sent down here. Wounds lying so long, of course, must kill them. It is horrible, mother." Despite her distress, Clewett's sense of duty prevailed, and in that same letter she closed with, "Nothing would induce me to give it up." After the war, it's interesting to kind of think about what was the long-term impact on these women. I often think about that. And that's, again, very hard to know, because even the things that we do have from them tend to be during the war. What about later? Most Newfoundland women, nurses and VADs, resumed their lives with really little apparent change in their pre-war plans. As in Canada, very few VADs, despite this was the big fear of British nurses, but that VADs would claim to be nurses after the war. Most of them did not pursue formal nursing training after the war. Johnson married Brian Dunfield as she had planned. She lived in St. John's, and they raised their 3 children. Frances Clewett upgraded her teaching qualifications, went home to Ballorem, and took over the school there. She never married or had children, but she helped her brother raise his child. Her brother had been widowed. Bertha Forsey married a decorated Newfoundland war hero, and she moved to Saskatoon. She retired from nursing, raised 4 children there, but she was a very active person in her community. In 1939, she proudly donned her uniform and was presented to the King and Queen when they visited Saskatoon. 2 of her sons served in World War II. Her daughter Grace followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming a nurse and serving overseas in World War II. She recalled that all this was done with her mother's encouragement. But again, our sources are limited. What I like to reflect on is the fact that these women, the majority of them, came home. Many of them shortly after the war married. Sybil Johnson didn't even get all the way home. Brian Dunfield was waiting for her in New York, and they married there. So a lot of them got married right after the war, started their families. And what I think about is 20, 22, 23 years later, they are told once again to do their patriotic duty and send their sons off to another war. And how that must have been very hard for them. They had none of the illusions from the beginning of World War I, particularly these women. And they were expected to send their children again, even though, as Clewett said, some of them would always have sad sights before their eyes.
As World War I came to an end, 3 young men from Labrador began their journey home, only to face an entirely new challenge. With winter setting in and the coast freezing over, their trek would take them hundreds of miles through harsh conditions, revealing just how isolated Labrador was from the outside world. To share this incredible story of resilience and survival, we're joined by storyteller and historian Dave Padden.
This story comes from southern and central Labrador in the winter of 1918, 1919, and I guess it's set against the backdrop of the extreme isolation that prevailed in those areas once shipping had finished for the season. When the coastal steamers finished up and the ice froze in, the coast froze in say November, you didn't really know what was going on in the outside world probably until June, when the ice broke up and the first boat arrived. Again, you would get a dog team mail or two during the winter, but that news was weeks or months out of date. So it was extremely isolated in those areas. So sometime in the spring, or probably early summer of 1918, 3 young fellows from Labrador decided to enlist in the military, and they went to St. John's to join the Newfoundland Regiment. They were James Gowdy from Northwest River in central Labrador, which is my hometown, Charles Michelin from Sabasquasha, which was about 12 miles away from Northwest River, and Steve McDonald from Cartwright on the coast of Labrador. They made their way to St. John's, and they were training down there, fully expecting to go overseas to France and fight in the Great War. But they were lucky. The war ended before they finished their training. So extremely lucky, I guess. So their problems weren't over. They had to make their way back home to Labrador, and they were in a bit of a race against time because the coast was due to freeze in. This was, of course, November 11th. They were demobilized a couple of days later, I think, and they had to get home as quickly as they could because shipping was soon going to finish for the season. So they got on a train here in St. John's, made their way to Humbermouth near Corner Brook, and got on the SS Ethy, which was heading north to Battle Harbour. Coincidentally, it was the Ethy's last trip north. On the way back south, she went ashore at Cowhead and was lost, although I don't think any lives were lost. But anyway, they got to Battle Harbour, and that was it. The coast had frozen in. They were hoping to catch a boat north from there, but there were none. Shipping was over for the season, so it looked like they were stuck in Battle Harbour. It's a long way from Cartwright and a much longer way to Northwest River. But they were young trapper types, and they were used to walking long distances, so they decided to walk home. It's a bit of an undertaking. I guess Battle Harbour to Northwest River is about 300 miles, 500 kilometers, and up to Cartwright's about half of that, I suppose, or a little less. So a lot of walking to be done. And this was the winter of the Spanish flu, it should be noted as well, so there was a lot of sickness on the coast. So they either made or purchased snowshoes and sleds to haul their gear with. And, excuse me, they set off, I'm not sure the exact date, I think it was sometime early December. They set off for home. So they had to walk north. They stayed in various places along the way, trappers' cabins and small communities. And they did some hitchhiking by dog team, although there wasn't a lot of that to be done. It was mostly walking. And it was a Labrador winter. It was bitter cold, of course, but they were pretty hardy young fellows. They were used to that. And on January the 9th, Steve McDonald walked into his hometown of Cartwright to find out that 21% of the population of Sandwich Bay had died in the Spanish flu. And the whole place was pretty devastated and flat on its back, so it was a pretty nasty surprise to greet him on his homecoming. Gowdy and Michelin kept on walking. I don't believe they stopped in Cartwright. They were farther inland and they carried on north. And there's quite a ways to go at that point. And I'm pretty sure they spent the odd night out, probably just with a fire going, and slept rough in the bush. But they were trappers. It wasn't a big deal to them. So they carried on, and on January the 24th, 1919, they came out on the frozen surface of Lake Melville, Back Bay it's called, which is a sort of a southern extension of Lake Melville, which is the big saltwater inlet that goes right up as far as Happy Valley Goose Bay. So still had about 100 miles to go, or 110 or 20. So they started off walking up the bay, And at one point, yeah, this was January 24th, at one point they saw a dog team coming towards them. Now, this was a kind of an unusual thing to see anybody in the winter in those days. And so, of course, they spotted each other. The dog team was going east, and the two fellows were heading west. And they stopped and they had a bit of a yarn. And they boiled a kettle, had a cup of tea. And it was quite a surprise for the driver of the dog team, who was my grandfather, Dr. Harry Padden, who had actually done Gaudy's and Michelin's medicals some months before and certified them to go off and train to join the military. He was very surprised to see them, and they stopped and he said, I thought you guys were training. I thought you were gone overseas to the war. And they said, oh, doctor, the war is over. He had no idea, because as I said, it was so isolated. Nobody in central Labrador had any idea that the war was over. I often wonder if maybe he asked who won, but probably not. Anyway, it was a total surprise to him, so he was quite pleased at that news, of course. And they spent a little time together, and then he headed off towards Cartwright, which he had no idea what had happened there either. He himself had caught the Spanish flu in Northwest River and been out of commission for about 2 weeks. A couple of people had died in Northwest River, but nothing like the problems in Cartwright. So the two young fellows kept walking westward, and my grandfather headed off towards Cartwright. And on January the 26th, 1918, it was recorded in the Hudson's Bay Company Journal that Gaudy and Michelin arrived today. Actually, Michelin had gone to Sabasquatcha, but Gaudy told them that they had both gotten back. And Gaudy and Michelin arrived today and informed us that the Great War was over. We had no idea. This was, yes, January 26, 1919. And my grandmother wrote at the time that everybody in the village got together and made a huge bonfire down by the river and celebrated that night. And as she wrote, we had so little to celebrate for many years between war news and the Spanish flu. And I took Tony and Harry, Tony being my father, to this great bonfire, and it was one of their most vivid memories, even though my father would have been 4 at the time, and my Uncle Harry would have been 3. And that's the end of the story, pretty well. It's a testament, I think, to those 3 young fellas that they were able to do that and walk all the way home. There's hundreds of miles, and there you go.
That brings us to the end of our 2-part series on our Unsung Heroes, World War I stories from Newfoundland and Labrador. It's been a privilege to share the incredible stories of courage, sacrifice, and perseverance that continue to shape our history. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of the sacrifices made by the brave men and women from our province who served during the Great War in so many ways. Thank you to everyone who has joined us on this journey, and to those who gathered these stories and shared their stories. Your voices will never be forgotten. From all of us here, thank you for watching, and may we always remember the sacrifices of our unsung heroes. St. John's Storytelling gratefully acknowledges the Perlin Family Trust and the Year of the Arts through Arts NL for funding this special project. We also acknowledge our partners in this project, MUN, the Royal Canadian Legion, and Rogers Cable. We dedicate this project to the memory of Dr. Rob Shea, who helped plant the seeds of the project before his sudden passing. These stories are but a small part of his lasting legacy.
Was that 4 or 5? He's lost count and still thinks he can drive. Do you think he knows that when he is caught and charged with impaired driving, he'll lose his license and a lot more? If he gets in his car, he'll face costs exceeding $20,000. Does he realize he could have a criminal record for his choice to drive? And it could be much worse if he crashes. Wonder what he'll be thinking tomorrow.
Visit ArriveAlive.org to find out more. Arrive Alive. Drive sober.
You're watching an interesting local show on Rogers TV and you want to know more. That's when you head to RogersTV.com. Our website provides more information about our programs, our hosts, our schedule, and about how you too can get involved with Rogers TV. Visit us online at RogersTV.com.
Welcome, everyone. We're so glad you've joined us here at Heart Matters today. We know that your time is valuable, so we're honored that you would take a bit of your time to tune in. Every fall, hundreds of churches and organizations across our country participate in something very special, and it's all centered around these small boxes. Many of you will be familiar with Operation Christmas Child shoeboxes. But in case you aren't, we're happy to welcome Kendra and Robbie Lynn from Operation Christmas Child to the program today to give us some insight into this powerful ministry. Also joining us as today's musical guests, we're happy to have Carrie Wheeler sing a couple of songs for us. So sit back, listen in, and we hope you enjoy the show.
God sent His Son, and they called Him Jesus, and He came to love. He lived for King, but He lived and died to buy my pardon. An empty grave is there to prove my Savior lives, and because He lives, oh, I can face tomorrow. Because He lives, all my fear is gone, and because I know He holds the future, well, life is worth the living just because He lives. And then one day, well, I'll cross that river, and I'll fight life's final war with pain. Oh, but then as death gives way to victory, I'll see the lights of glory and life is worth the living just because he lives.
My name is Robbie Lynn Nickel, and I am the Regional Manager with Atlantic Canada for Operation Christmas Child. Right from the get-go, the mission of Operation Christmas Child is to provide a tangible expression of God's love to children in need, together with the local church worldwide, and to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ. How we do that is by partnering with churches and community groups and people all across Canada to put together a shoebox with gifts, school supplies, all sorts of really exciting things. So when kids open them, they're excited to see them. And with that, we provide a gospel presentation and let them know that it's not just a box, it's not just a toy box, but it's because God loves you and there's people who care about you.
My name is Kendra Shields, and I have the privilege of serving as the director for Operation Christmas Child in Canada. For the last 15 years,